Hi, thank you for joining us today and welcome to this Hasselblad webinar. I hope you're well and looking forward to spending the next hour with us. I'm Mark Whitney, part of Hasselblad's marketing team, and I'm coming to you today from the office of Hasselblad UK. I'm also joined by my colleague, Chris Cooze, who is Hasselblad's Global Technical Communications Manager. And today's webinar is the fourth in a series of what we are calling the Phocus Q&A webinars. If you haven't joined us before, the Phocus Q&A webinars are designed to be driven by you, the audience. So to be held on a regular basis, you are able to suggest topics or questions during the registration process. We'll then consider this and cover as many as possible during the webinar. And we'll select the most requested or relevant topics for Chris to talk through. So just to take you through a few slides before we get started. As always, this webinar is being recorded. So if you want to look back on it afterwards, it should be up on YouTube or the Hasselblad YouTube channel within a few hours of the webinar finishing. You'll also find all our other previous webinars on our Hasselblad YouTube channel as well. Everything from interviews to product interviews. So yeah, you can find everything on there. Also, I just wanted to remind everyone of the previous topics that we've covered in these Phocus Q&A webinars. We still get quite a few suggestions each month for topics that we've already covered. So have a look at the topics here, and if there's anything you'd like to find out more information on, again, you can find recordings of these webinars on our Hasselblad YouTube channel. So to today's agenda. These are the topics we're going to cover today. First of all, layout triggers. Now, this is something that not a lot of people realise that Phocus can do. So Chris will take us through the benefits of working with layout triggers and then how to configure them for your own personal preferences. Exposure algorithms. Again, this is a common question that we've had quite a few times, especially suggested for this webinar. So what are the difference between the V1, the V2 and the V3 algorithms for the exposure? And Chris will be talking about when to use each one. Again, a lot of questions on optimizing color workflow and how to maintain as much color detail throughout your workflow. So Chris will be talking more about that. And then finally, sharpening. Chris will be talking about the sharpening tool, how to work with it, and how each of the values and the tools work in relation to the workflow. So approximate running time, about 50 minutes again, as usual, hopefully leaving us a little bit of time at the end for Q&A. With regards to the questions, if you could please keep the questions related to today's topics. Any questions that we don't get to answer or aren't related to the topics, feel free to ask them again for the next Phocus Q&A webinar. So just to talk a little bit about the next Q&A webinar. So we've got today's, which is a Phocus Q&A webinar. Next month, we're going to change it a little bit. We're going to do an X system Q&A webinar. So any questions relating to the X1D, X1D2 or 907X configuration and settings, similar format to this. So you suggest your topics and questions when you register, and then we'll pick the most common and regular topics to then cover during the webinar. And then we'll return back to Phocus Q&A again for November. So both of these are on the Hasselblad website if you'd like to register, and we'll also include a link in the thank you email we send you after today's webinar. So just as a confirmation, the next Q&A webinar will be an X System Q&A webinar, 20th of October, and it's for questions on the functionality and settings for the current X1D, X1D2 and 907X cameras. So I hope you join us for that. So let's meet Chris. How are you, Chris?
Hi, Mark. Good, thank you.
So I'll just throw over the presenting duties to you.
Thanks very much. And we'll just get started. Hopefully you can see the screen. So, hi everyone. The first subject for today is layouts and triggers. Quite a few questions come in on this one. So let's have a quick look at the basics on layouts. So by default, there are 6 layouts that are pre-programmed, if you like, into Phocus, plus the edit option, which is something we'll use when we go live in the software. The edit option allows you to take one of the 6 that are pre-programmed and effectively create your own version of those layouts or any particular look and feel that you like. Now, basically, we'll work through each of these so you can see what they are, what the changes are, and then as we work through, we'll look at the customization and in turn of what do each of these settings here allow you to do. Once we've done that, we'll look at the triggers. The triggers is really where the speed up in workflow occurs. So basically, if you are always working in a certain way, so when you're shooting tethered, when you're importing and so on, and you always want certain screen layouts, tool layouts, etc., then the preferences in Phocus allow us to specify when X event happens, make the screen look like this. So for instance, by default, when we launch, the standard layout is set up there, but again, if you want a different look and feel, if you want to use 2 screens every time, etc., you just create a layout and then program that in to launch at the same time as the software is launched. Additionally, when you plug in a tethered camera, we can make the screen and tools that are displayed look a certain way. Same with a media card. Additionally, when you launch certain tool sets, so when I click on the capture tab or the adjustment tab and I hold the option, or if you're on a Windows machine, the Alt, basically that can trigger a particular look for tools and again the layouts of the screen. So rather than spend too much time talking about it here, we'll go through it in a little bit of detail once we get to the live software side of things. But effectively what we can do is customize the look and feel of Phocus in terms of the tools, the adjustments that are pre-applied, the size of the thumbnails, the number of thumbnails, etc. All of those type of configurations can be pre-programmed and then that can be loaded on a particular event happening in the software. Okay, so moving on to the exposure algorithm. So this is obviously within the exposure tool. Now, original versions of Phocus going way back now would have shipped with V1. So current version 3.6.x, version 3 is the default. So any captures that you import into Phocus today with the latest version of Phocus, version 3 is what will be used. There are other options in there, V2, V1, etc. But basically, if you have any file within your system that's not been adjusted for shadow, recovery, or clarity, the system will attempt to use version V3. Now, V1 and V2 are there for, should we say, more legacy or previously corrected files. So if I've got something from my, I don't know, H5D 50C camera that I've already corrected, adjusted highlight, shadow settings, etc., it will allow me to keep the built-in settings and work with those. Obviously, if I wanted to, once I've got the image in, I can update it to V3 and modify the settings if required. But it's there more of a to support previously corrected files. So what's the difference basically between 1, 2, and 3? So if we take V1 as our original standard algorithm that was in Phocus, as we moved forward, with the latest CMOS sensors and so on, the V2 algorithm, what was in the exposure tool, enabled us to get more detail or recover more detail from the shadows, highlights, and control the detail that could be extracted via the clarity tool. In addition, we added in a detail tool, which allows you, in conjunction with the clarity tool here, to modify how much of the fine detail the clarity tool affects. So that was a big step forward. And then with the current version, V3, we took the particular settings for recovery, shadow, and clarity and improved them over and above version 2. But more importantly, we added in improvements for the handling of the contrast and brightness sliders. So the whole exposure tool was basically updated again. And what we'll do when we go into the live software, I've got a few files that will show you some of the big differences between V1, V3, just so you can see the amount of change that the tool has given. But just as a quick example, here's a segment from a file. Hopefully this comes across okay on the presentation, as it were, but this is based on V1. And if you really push the recovery slider here up towards almost maximum, to try and bring back some of the detail in these highlights and burnt out areas there, you'll reach a point where you start to grey out, and also you've almost got color fringing and color patches here and on the high contrast edges, and that's almost on 100% recovery there. So you also begin, as it grays out along here, you will also begin to lose the detail, and it will just become a continuous tone. So not fantastic at that point, although this is quite an extreme example. Just to give a very quick example of the difference, V3 with the same file, correcting to pretty much the same level, you can see here that we don't have the fringing, we don't have the color patches there. Additionally, we've kept detail where we've lost it and it's gone softened and sort of starting to grey out here. We've kept that detail in the file. So we'll look at that in some more detail with some more examples once we go live with the software. Sharpness tool. So just briefly cover again what the different settings are for. Then we'll look at the recommended defaults, etc. So the amount obviously is the strength of the sharpening effect that you want to apply. For our software, the amount goes from 0 to 1,000, whereas say Adobe Photoshop goes from 0 to 500. As an example, to show, we're basically 2 steps for every one almost in Adobe. So where our default sharpening for a standard file might be 100, if you were to open the same file in Camera Raw, its default level is somewhere between 40 and 50. Radius. So this is the distance or the extent, should we say, that the effect would be applied across a detailed edge, let's put it that way. And generally, when you're working with Hasselblad RAW files, it's a high-res image, and so the actual radius setting can be quite small. Generally between 0.5 and 1 is probably about right. If you were working on a sort of much lower resolution file, then you could get away with a much larger radius. Threshold. Now, this particular setting determines the point at which sharpening affects the image or not. So imagine if I had a portrait or a particular subject that had a lot of low-level texturing. If the threshold value was very low, sort of 0 basically, sharpening is applied to pretty much every pixel. As you bring the sharpness up, it may then look for detail where you don't, and try and sharpen it where you don't want it. So imagine maybe a model's skin, or maybe a painted concrete wall or something. It will start to pick up edges that don't really exist and then over sharpen it. So the threshold allows you to modify that minimum value so that you're not sharpening detail that the system thinks is there, but you don't want sharpened. And then the dark limit basically sets the minimum level that the sharpening effect will be applied to. So imagine if we have very dark shadows, there's little or no point trying to bring out detail or sharpen something that's almost black. So you would set that dark limit so that you're not effectively trying to sharpen shadow noise. And again, depending on where your black point is and what you've done with the image will determine what level you set here, but we'll talk about the defaults in a little while. So the suggested settings, you've probably seen already. If you import an image, and with the standard setting, the default sharpening value comes in at about 100. Normally you'll get 1 on the radius and then 0 on the threshold and 10 on the dark. It's basically what you would get. But radius normally, as we've previously said, is around 0.8 to 1. It is pretty much a good starting point, and you can modify from there depending on your file. Threshold, again, 0 is default for most things. However, if you use the portrait import setting, it's automatically set to a higher value of around 3. But again, depending on how much detail is it in that, how much detail it's picking up in the skin, you may want to put that higher, 3, 5, or 6 or 7, maybe even a little bit higher, depending on that detail level. And then dark limit, again, depends on how much you're going to be working on the shadow areas, brightening them up, etc. But recommended range is sort of 0 to 20, and that's why we put our default in at pretty much 10 as the middle of the range, and then you can tweak from there. The different import standards set different levels, and obviously within the tool itself you also have medium, high and portrait, and again they vary. So for instance, if I was to use the product import setting, that has a sharpening level of 350. If I was to select within the tool the medium setting, that gives me a sharpness level of 180, a threshold of 0, and a dark level of 10. So again, various starting points are built in, but the important thing really to remember is that once you get a level that works for you in a particular shoot or in the type of workflow you have, you can save that as a preset. Very, very straightforward, and then effectively that new preset gets added to this list, and you can have it for various workflows set in there and can be applied very, very quickly. Again, we'll look at this in a little bit more detail when we're actually in the software. So maximizing the color gamut. Now we've covered this 2 or 3 times over various webinars over the last year or so, but what I've tried to do in the next few slides is just really summarize the work flow that it would give you, if you like, the Hasselblad color for as long as possible until you need to make choices of what changes you want to make, depending on, are you printing, are you creating a new file for maybe web uploading to the web, etc. So how do we get to that point? First step obviously is to import the files into Phocus. Now that could be through tethering or through importing from media card, and effectively we then get our 3F file in Phocus. You would then do the work you need to do. That could be a lot or a little. It could be effectively just applying lens corrections, checking the exposure tool and so on, white balance, getting it to the point where you're happy. And then you're going to work on the file, the rest of it within maybe another third-party app. So this is the important part, really. At this point, we are going to export the image, and generally we would try and keep it in as high a bit depth image type as possible, so a 16-bit TIFF, something like that. But more importantly, when we output from Phocus, we need to make sure that the output profile is set to source, and that will then embed within the file header either Hasselblad RGB or L-Star RGB, and that depends on your working color space. Whichever you've selected is what will be embedded. So once that's saved, you then move on to your third-party app. So as an example, I'm going to take Photoshop. So with that, with the Hasselblad RGB embedded in the file as an example, depending on how you've got Photoshop, depends on the alarms, etc. that you will see, but for my own setup, when I try and open that particular file, 16-bit TIFF, it will tell me this file has an embedded profile. It's different from your normal working space. Do you want to use your real one, or do you want to use the embedded one? So at this point, I would then use the embedded, and that would then change my working space to the Hasselblad RGB. I would then finish my editing of that file, get it to the point where I'm happy, and I either want to print it or save it as a new file type. So at this point, I could print straight to my wide format printer, or I could say I want to create a web upload and I need to export it as maybe a JPEG and convert the file to sRGB. So at this point, we've got a fairly wide gamut color space, so Hasselblad RGB, and we need to modify the files so that when I create, let's say, a JPEG file, the color space, the changes there, we need to modify the color and bring the color range, or color gamut, down to suit the file type we're working with. Now, normally with that, in this case, Photoshop would then be working with a particular rendering intent. So the way that will handle colors that are new color space, so let's assume sRGB, the colors we have in our original file aren't available in the sRGB color space. So we need a way of fitting all of the colors in our image down into a color space that actually is printable or workable in sRGB. So just quick roundup before we move on to rendering intents, etc. So the output presets, we have looked at this very briefly before, but within Phocus, when you create an output, you can select pretty much your file format, your PPI, dimensions, and most importantly, the output profile. So here, if you were to click this down arrow, you would see all of the usual, so sRGB, Adobe RGB, ProPhoto, etc., all listed there. But for this case, we want to stay within Hasselblad RGB. So it's most important here that you choose source as the output profile, and then the rest is up to you. But effectively, 16-bit or the highest resolution you want to work for in terms of bit depth is better to work here. But this is the important part, the source. So we just briefly talked about our wide format color space. So Hasselblad RGB or even the L-Star RGB, they have a wide gamut. And so depending on how we're going to deal with the file, if we're going to print it or we're going to upload it to the web, etc., we need to remap the colors that aren't usable. So as an example, the white or the gray area here, that is the extent of the Hasselblad RGB compared to Adobe RGB. With this one, you can see the sRGB color space or color gamut is much smaller than the Hasselblad RGB. Just as critically, this is a Epson traditional photo paper from a standard Epson photo printer, and you can see here that this color gamut is considerably smaller than the Hasselblad RGB. So we need a way of getting the colors we had in our image into a look that is actually printable. As I said, that was through rendering intent. So just to quickly go over the main ones, general ones you hear talked about will be perceptual and relative colorimetric, although there are others such as saturation and absolute colorimetric. But for most photo work, generally it's perceptual and relative colorimetric. And the big difference really is how colors that are out of gamut or not within the color space that we want to use, how do we get those color points back to a value that is printable? And so you have two choices. Relative colorimetric remaps the colors that are outside of our work color space. So this would be, let's say, an sRGB. These colors aren't printable. So with relative colorimetric, effectively all of those colors are remapped to its nearest equivalent. So you end up where you have, in this particular example, a range of greens. It could be that they end up very, very close in tone, even though on the original image we were working on, there was a lot of differences in tone. So depending on the subject, depends on which one of these used. Whereas perceptual, same situation, but with this particular way of remapping the colors, what happens is the tonal differences or the shift difference between each of the color patches is tried to maintain. So the whole image is remapped effectively to bring these out of gamut colors, where possible, into gamut, but still keep those differences in terms of, as we said on the previous example, these greens are going to be very similar. We've got a step difference here. So it keeps it more pleasing, more sort of continuous tone, should we say. Once you're in Photoshop, you've got your image from Hasselblad RGB, it's opened up, you've finished working on it. Then you need to make a couple of checks really as to how is Photoshop going to deal with this file when I either save it as a JPEG or try and print it, etc. And so this is just a quick screen grab of a default setting in Photoshop. Now, you can see here in conversion options that by default, it's set to relative colorimetric. So I would probably change that to perceptual for most of the photo work that I do. It'd be a nicer way of remapping the out of gamut colors back in. So that would be a standard pull down there, and that would be my preference set once and for all. Or you could, if you want to, for one image on the fly, you could convert the image, obviously save the master and create a backup, as it were, and then here to save it as a JPEG, let's say I could change it on the fly from relative colorimetric to perceptual or whatever I wanted, choose my color space output, and then save as a JPEG from there. So there's a few ways of doing bits and pieces. Depends on how you work and how often you work that way. So quick summary then, really, to maximize color in this workflow for Hasselblad color we're talking about here. Most important, when you completed the work in Hasselblad Phocus, and you want to take that file out as a high-res TIFF, 16-bit, something like that, when you export the file, it's important that you use the source as the output profile. That makes sure that you're staying within the Hasselblad color space, even though you're going to then open it in Photoshop or Affinity. You've then got that embedded in the file, so that when you then open it within that third-party app, you're then still working within that Hasselblad color space. As we just said, basically, just embed whichever one you want from your working space and make sure it stays there. And then, be it Adobe Photoshop or whatever third-party app you want to use, try and get it to warn you every time there's a profile mismatch, so that you've got an on-the-fly choice each time you open the file. Oh yes, I want to use the Hasselblad color space, or no, I want to stick to my own. So at this point, as I've just shown you in Photoshop, when it opens up, it will tell me, no, this file has got an embedded Hasselblad profile. Do you want to use that as your working space? And then you can continue from there. Okay, so that's enough of the presentation slides, as it were. Let's now just move on to the live software. And I'm going to go back to our first topic, which was the layouts and triggers. So here is Phocus just opened up as standard. Layout tool is here. And now if I just click there, you can see the first list of items, 6 items there. That are the items that are pre-programmed in Phocus when you do a default install. I have a couple set up here that I've recently added just to show you the differences. Now, each of those particular layouts has a certain look and feel. So what I'll do, I'll just take this standard layout here. I think if you were to open Phocus first time, it would actually look like that, where you have the thumbnails underneath. And so if I now load standard, it should show me exactly no change there. So that is what you would get. If I was to go to browse mode, effectively this gives me my finder, my thumbnails, and my tool set. Viewer literally just gives me my main image. Now, this could be useful if you're using two screens. I could set the viewer up to have the single image on my main screen and my tools on the secondary screen, something like that. Thumbnails only is very good if you're importing from a media card. You see, for selecting files, looking at large numbers of files. And then light mode, all it adds is the finder at the side here, or Explorer if you're on a Windows machine. So it depends what you're trying to do and what where are you in your workflow effectively. If I show you my standard view, effectively it looks just like a normal setup. I have my tools set up to load in a certain way, thumbnails, and my finder. I also have a capture setup, which has the capture tab set. It also has the tools that I use most often when I'm shooting tethered, so my reproduction mode, capture sequence, and so on. All of these tools are preset. Now, it could be that you have a certain look and feel that you prefer. So, for instance, I prefer to keep thumbnails at the side, and I also prefer to have the thumbnails slightly larger. So again, this is just a case of getting this screen and layout to look how I want it. And a lot of this will vary based on the size of the screen, the resolution of the screen that you're working on, whether you're using one screen, two screen. But it's a case of get it looking as you want. And then once you're happy, we can save that as a particular setup. So I'm just going to go to the adjustment tab, make sure I've got everything in here as I want it. Yep. And now I can go to layouts, click edit. And from here, I can modify either a preset or one of my own that I've made. So in this case, I've just modified the view and look here. So I'm going to duplicate the capture setup and call it something that makes sense for your layout at that point. And then as I'm going to delete mine later, I'm going to keep it here. Now, once you've created it, it's telling you that compared to when I started, I moved some of these tools, I changed the size of the thumbnails and so on. So it's asking me, do I want to update the stored settings with the new look? So I can say yes, update from that, and then OK. Before I click OK, you'll notice that we have four main setting areas. So the views basically controls what am I looking at? Do I want the finder window? Do I want the thumbnails like this, my viewer window, and my tools? Am I happy with them as they are? And the include sizing ensures that where I've crimped in to the finder window, it's the correct size. My thumbnails have been resized. It will remember all of that as well. Tool layout, if I've modified the location and position of tools, which ones are on, off, which ones are displaying or not, it will remember that. Toolbar, if I've modified the contents of the upper toolbar, it can remember that as well. Finally, and this is the one really to be careful of, is adjustments. If I've got a particular amount of adjustment pre-programmed in here, do I actually want that to be applied to every image I apply this to? Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. You know, if I've got a particular offset because I'm using a particular adapter or so on, I can pre-program that correction and it will remember it. But the danger is if I have a weird adjustment in here and I've ticked this and saved it and I then use it, I can be applying that adjustment to every single file that I'm importing or capturing through tethered shooting, and it will affect every image and I'll have to try and reset and so on. So just be aware of that. Okay. So that's a basic overview of what layout functions, should we say, in terms of the look and feel and so on. Very, very quick and dirty. But the triggers is the important bit, really. So if I go to preferences, so I can click there. We have a whole section here for triggers. Now at launch, you can choose a particular look and feel. Generally, none is selected, and that gives you the equivalent of standard anyway. When you plug in a camera, so I could say, right, a capture. So for me, that one would be perfect. But when I'm importing from a memory card, where there may be 100, 200 images that I've shot there, I can choose between thumbnails maybe on light mode. And again, if I'm using a large screen, I may want many more thumbnails on display, and I may want them larger. If you remember, we could program the sizing, so that way I could get a thumbnail only screen for selecting what to import, what not to, and I could do that. So again, thumbnails only is probably quite useful there. The other option is if you have different tool sets for different types of work. So if within product photography or architectural photography, you may have a certain set of tools that you want to use, probably reproduction mode, scene calibration mode, and so on for the LCC correction, that type of thing. And those sets of tools may be slightly different to what you would use when editing maybe portraits. And so you can set up different tool layouts and save them as architectural, portrait, etc. And again, set them up so that when you click the adjust tab, when you load that with the option key down, you can choose a setup to load at that point. That could be quite useful for moving away from the default to, as I say, one for a specific type of workflow, and then very quick, then you can click the tab without the option key or key pressed down, and you load the default values. Okay. Hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. Cool. So now let's move quickly on to, time's moving on, to the exposure tool. And what I'm going to do here is load a couple of example files so that you can see, if you like, the big changes that V1 had, V3, the improvements, if you like, between V1 and V3. So this is a very badly exposed file, but it's done purposely, believe me. What we need to do here then is try and recover as much as we can. Can we get a usable image out of this shot? So I'm going to set V1 as my default correction, so the original algorithm here. And you can see the real burnt out highlight areas here. So just to show you live the example that I showed you within the presentation, so you can see that I wasn't cheating. Starting here, I'm going to zero off the EV. And now what I'm going to try and do is apply a recovery correction. Try and get as much as we dare. Yeah. And although we're bringing this highlight detail back, you can see there's pretty much a hard edge now. We've got some color fringing. We're breaking up and fringing here, but also it's beginning to gray out. We've lost detail, huge amount of detail lost there. So if I now go to V3 and do the same thing, you can see, let it update, go up to the similar level. So we have not so much of a hard edge there. We don't have the color fringing there, but we've kept the detail here. Now, probably the best, if I go somewhere like there, we've got an extreme here. So from pretty much pure white through to shadow area there. So this is going to push both sides of the algorithm, the shadow and the recovery, to the limit. So if I go to V1 and try to recover the highlight detail, probably about there, you can just see that it's starting to lose some of the information. You can see here we've got almost a hard line on the edge of where we hit the shadow area, and if we start to try and recover shadow, that doesn't help either. If I now go to V3, I can get away with a lot more correction if I needed to. There we go, we've got a smoother transition of tones through, and we don't have any of that hard edge on the shadow area. So if I wanted to bring up the shadow slightly, I could without causing any even more problems. So that's one example of what you can do with the V3 compared to V1. Sorry, too many V's. One more quick example would be the hat area here. So if I go back to V1, and if we pay attention to this area here, as I bring up the recovery, somewhere like that, you can see that we've started to lose the detail here. It's beginning to grey out, and we're starting to lose the actual detailed areas. Okay, as well as it affecting the rest of the image. I could have obviously applied this correction through an adjustment layer for a more targeted correction. Now, if I zero that and go to V3, I think very much you can see we've kept all of that individual detail. Let's just, step back just to maybe 50%. There we go, we can actually get away with probably that level. Yep. So again, the V3 version 3 algorithm just enables us to pull that little bit more detail out of the highlight recovery, as it were, without affecting other areas in the image, without that graying or color fringing. So it's a big change, a big improvement over the original, and even over V2, to be honest. And as I say, for most files, you will go straight to V3. V1 really and V2 are there for more legacy or pre-corrected files that you're looking again at. But even there, you can take those files and then convert them to V3 once you then reopen and re-edit. Okay, hopefully that makes things a little bit clearer. So moving on to the sharpen tool, you've got a question mark, you've just come back on.
Yeah, sorry. Just while we're on the algorithms, we've had a question from Dominique. Does this apply to all Hasselblad cameras, the algorithms, or does it work better for some cameras and not others?
No, obviously, the V1 original algorithm had been, should we say, tweaked to work with the CCD chips we were using at that point. And then as the CMOS chips have been brought online, we're trying to extract as much detail as possible from the CMOS chips that we now have. And so CCD, you can extract as much as ever before anyway, but with the CMOS, the V2 and now V3 just enables us to pull more and more information out of it. So V3 enhancements really work really, really well with the 50 megapixel, 100 megapixel CMOS sensors that we have now. That's really where most of the work has been targeted, to make sure that we can extract the maximum amount of detail on the later sensors.
Okay, great, thank you.
Okay, so going to move on to the sharpen tool, and what I'm going to do, just going to, there we go, load in my default edit that I had on this particular file. Okay, let's just make sure we're happy with that. Yeah, cool. In terms of the sharpness tool, I'm just going to float that so it's a little bit easier in the middle of the screen. So I'm set here to sort of a standard value, so 100 with the 1 on the radius and 10 on the dark limit. But hopefully Dolly won't mind, but I'm going to move in to there just to show you the sort of detailed areas that we normally work with. And if I was to increase the sharpness, there's 0, as I move forward, everything gets sharpened, everything from shadows right the way up to the highlight areas and so on. But threshold is where now I can bring into play, do I really want to sharpen the skin more, or do I just want to bring out details maybe in the fabric, in the hair and so on? So I can play with the threshold. So as I go up here, you can see that the skin gets less sharpened. If I zoom out a little bit, it means we don't really want to sharpen these areas, but it would be quite nice to keep, where I have detailed areas like maybe eyelashes, the eyes themselves, the flower, the very detailed areas, that would be nice to keep sharp or even sharpen a little bit, but I don't particularly want to sharpen the skin. So with sharpness, I would apply, I mean, I've gone hugely over here just so you can actually see it on screen. I would probably start with a sharpness value of around 90, something like that, and then tweak this threshold value. I can show you if I basically take this all the way up, then we've turned off that sharpening effect right across, basically. If I go down to 0, every single thing gets sharpened. And so again, if I bring it up, you can see, I mean, that's getting to a point where it's overly sharp. If I zoom in now on the flower, you can see this is way overly sharpened. But again, I can now bring this threshold up and it stops each of the detail. At what point do you stop? I would say about there. Again, depends per image. Not sure how well this is going to come over on the actual presentation to you. One classic area would be, yeah, this is probably a good thing. I talked earlier about if you had a painted wall or something like that. So if I zoom in here to 100%, as I bring up the sharpness level, it could be that just because you have this texture, this underlying texture in the wall, maybe if I go to 200%, you'll see it better. I've got this underlying texture in the wall, and the sharpening tool, what it does then, it sees that and it thinks that's detail and it tries to bring that out. Obviously, if the rest of the image can take the sharpening level, but you want the low level detail, again, this is where the threshold comes in. I could start to bring that up to the point where the wall isn't being sharpened. So if I just go back to 100%, you'll see what I mean. We can keep that unsharpened or not as sharpened, and basically then the amount then is only being applied to the really detailed areas, the detail we actually do want to extract. Okay. Hopefully that came over okay on the screen. It's a bit difficult.
Just a quick question
Yes.
on that, Chris, while we're on
Yeah.
threshold. Bob is asking, does the threshold work with the tone of light level? Is that how it works?
Yeah, so effectively, sharpening looks for edges between tones within your image, effectively, in a simplistic way of looking at it. And so where you have a very detailed area, you'll have a lot of tonal differences at a sort of micro level. And what the software will look to do is increase the differences where those tones butt up against a lighter or darker tone. And so it could be, so for instance, on the concrete wall there's a texture there, or it could be the model's skin maybe. there's an underlying like low level texture, and the sharpen tool will see it as an edge. And so as you bring the sharpness up, it will try to sharpen that so you can see the individual areas of the wall, texture in the wall, which you may want, but for 9 times out of 10 in this case, you wouldn't. You just want to leave it as it is. So the threshold tool allows you to limit the effect, if you like, the fine detail area. So you can take the threshold up. It won't look for the low level detail. It will look for only the, should we say, the detailed areas that stand out already, and apply the sharpening tool there. So it's just a way of limiting at what level is, do you want to sharpen everything, including the low level detail? Or do you want to limit that low level, but obviously keep the high end that's already sharp, the detailed areas, you want those to increase, but maybe we don't want that low level. That's basically what the threshold tool is useful for.
Okay, thank you.
I think that probably covers most things. I'm just trying to think if I had a better example, Mark, for that. Let's just try this one. Oh, zoomed into 100% there. So again, this is in terms of the sharpening tool here, the default value of this file that's in, it's not been touched, is set at the 100. And if I was to lighten up some of the file there, just to bring out that, maybe you want to bring out the detail in some of these areas, but you don't really want to over sharpen what's already there. So again, if I over sharpen this now, because I'm going to go to a point, we start to see, the brickwork really being brought out, the continuous tone areas, if you like, of this stonework is being sharpened as well. So again, you could bring up the threshold value, and you can just see that detailing in what was the stonework has just been knocked back a little bit. And if I was to move to another area where we wanted it sharpened, so the detail, I've got that. So we want to keep that sharpening. Okay, this has gone too far because actually you're seeing artifacts along there, but you can see what I'm getting at in terms of you can limit the effect there on the sharpening. Okay, right. So moving quickly onto the color gamut. As I said, when we import the files in, by default, they're turned into 3FR files. So they're in the Hasselblad RAW. Additionally, you can modify the working space that you're in. By default, it will be Hasselblad RGB. But as we've covered in previous webinars, if you launch the reproduction tool, you can change your current working space. So you have a choice of L-Star, which is really wide gamut, or the Hasselblad RGB, which is, in fairness, it's fairly wide gamut itself. And so this is what will be embedded when you export the file. So for instance, if I now go to the export tool up here, and I'm going to put it on the desktop so it's easy for me. And if I just quickly click edit, you can see that my profile layout, I call it that just because it's quick and easy to get to. I've got it set up for a TIFF 16, but it could be a PSD 16 as well if I really wanted, full size. And the most important thing, as I said earlier, is choosing source. So this is what embeds the Hasselblad RGB or L-Star RGB, depending on what you've selected, into the header of the file, okay, as opposed to Adobe or sRGB, etc. So we'll keep that as source, click OK, click export. Okay, so just to show you now, bear with me, sorry, I'm just launching Photoshop. It was supposed to be open. Okay, so if I now click open and go to my desktop. So that's the file I've just exported. I'm going to click open. And straight away, it's telling me, look, you normally use sRGB. This particular file has a Hasselblad RGB embedded. Do you want to use that as your working space? So we click OK. And so I'm now working on my file within the Hasselblad RGB working space, color space. And now I can carry on editing as if I'm still sort of within focus and within that color space. Again, I can make all of my changes. And now when it comes to printing, I now need to make that choice, or if I'm exporting the file for my website, I now have to set up or choose the rendering intent to rejig the colors. So as an example, if I go to color settings, this is set to relative color metric, when actually for most of my photo work, perceptual is pretty good. So I can click OK. And now whatever I save as a JPEG, it will use perceptual instead of relative color metric. Or if I'm in the process of converting to an 8-bit file and then exporting as a JPEG, just as an example, I could go 8-bit file. So that will come down, and then I can assign, actually I should have done that the other way around, sorry. If I convert to a profile first, so I want to convert to sRGB, and here again, if I hadn't already set it, I could choose one of these rendering intents. So I'll stick with perceptual, click OK. So that now remaps all of the colors in my image to make sure they're in Gamut. And at this point, if I wanted to save as a JPEG, probably that I would create a copy of the file, convert it to 8-bit, and then save it. So in this case, we would choose JPEG, and then make sure it's on the desktop, save. And so that way, working through that workflow, I've kept Hasselblad color space as long as humanly possible, literally to the end of my image editing, and then I'm either going to print it or I'm going to export it to a particular file type for use on a website, etc., etc. And it's at that point I have to then make a change from Hasselblad RGB color space. I then have to convert it to another color space that is supported by either my website or my printer, basically.
Yep,
Yes,
right,
Mark.
Chris, thank you very much. Yeah, just before we finish up, so quick question relating to color from Arild. How does ProPhoto RGB differ to Hasselblad RGB?
So ProPhoto RGB is very similar in terms of the gamut size, etc., as Hasselblad RGB. They're very, very similar.
Okay. But we would always recommend using Hasselblad RGB in terms of getting the full color on the camera. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if you want the ultimate wide gamut, you could go L-star RGB within within Phocus, and then embed that, and then use that within there. And obviously, that's wider than ProPhoto. That way, also, not just the gamut size, but the remapping that Hasselblad does to the colors, etc. To get that Hasselblad look, that is also controlled and set within our color space, as it were. So that way, all of the transformations that we've done make sense. So you keep that all the way through to the very end, and to then you either want to print it or save it as something else. If you convert to ProPhoto, let's say, or Adobe RGB when you export from Phocus, then at that point, Phocus will do that transformation to that new color space. And again, it will then remap the colors to fit that.
Okay, and then just one last question to finish off from Dennis. Going back to the layouts, he's asking how to rename a new layout. He's currently unable to rename one that's titled entitled.
Okay.
I don't know if that's something you can show us.
If I go to edit, so if you want to rename it, you should just be able to click it like I did there.
Okay.
So literally just one click and it should highlight it. And then you can rename it to like
Okay.
that.
So I hope that works for you, Dennis. If not, please let us know and we'll have a look further.
Yep, sure.
And also then just very quickly, Roberto has just asked, can you show us again how to set the Photoshop warning for the profile mismatch? Where was that
Yes.
option?
Okay, no problem. 1 second. So effectively, that is in the Photoshop color setting. So that's Photoshop, edit, all the way down towards the bottom. You've got the three assign profile, convert to profile, and color settings within that. So if you see there, you've got edit, you've then got color settings, and that's where you can set the conversion option there.
Okay. And the profile mismatches is there on the bottom left.
Yes, yes.
Yeah,
This so basically ask when opening is the best, because then you may actually, in some circumstances, you might want to stay with your normal working space, but it's better to, for the system to ask you rather than do things in the background you don't realize what's been done.
Okay, great. Right, we'll finish up there. We've got to the hour. Thank you very much, Chris.
No problem.
And I'll just
stop sharing for you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, so hopefully you can see my screen again now. And as always, any feedback you're able to give us following the webinar is very much appreciated. Please let us know how we're doing and what you'd like to see more of. It's all very good information for us to plan for the future. And another reminder that this webinar and other webinars have been recorded and they're listed on the Hasselblad YouTube channel. So as I mentioned at the top of the webinar, any previous Phocus Q&A webinars you may have missed and the topics that have been included, you can find them on our Hasselblad YouTube page. The next Q&A webinar, as I said earlier, slightly different. Next month, we're going to do an X system Q&A for any settings and functionality of the X1D, X1D2 and 907X cameras. And Chris will take us through some of the screens on the camera for that. And then, of course, for anything Hasselblad, hasselblad.com. Everything on there from our future webinars and events, lots on our products, more information on our partner network around the world, lots of inspirational stories and images, lots on our history, and you can also request a demo and receive any support that you may need. So that's it for this webinar. Thank you again for joining us, and we hope to see you again on another future webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you.